Welcome to part 5 of the Pictorial Whole Cloth Quilt tutorial. Today we're going to delve into It's All in the Details. We're going to talk about the order in which we're going to do the stitching in the focal point and why. We'll get into some troubleshooting as we go down the road. And I think this will be a great learning process for you. Now, as you know, we're dealing with two different versions of this pictorial quilt. One is a church and one is a cabin. And we'll go into the differences as they come up. But the first thing we're going to do is stitch the outer frame around whichever one you're doing. The reason for that is that contains the batting all in that area, so it helps to stabilize your quilting. After the frame, or the outer frame that is, the next thing that we're going to concentrate on is the sky. Now it doesn't really need a lot of quilting, and your batting may say you can go up to 4 to 8 inches away, but we want to mash that batting down just a little bit. And it doesn't take a whole lot. All we have to do is imitate some low-lying stratus clouds, just like this, just curvy lines back and forth. I'm sure you can do that. And this is what it will end up looking like. Next up for either version will be the underbrush, that is the dividing point of the horizon between the sky and the snow. It's pretty easy to stitch, and it's almost like the thread sketching you did on the tree, just going back and forth and filling it in. So we've got our first 3 things stitched on both versions. So that's where the similarities end. I guess you really can't compare cabins and churches, can you? But no worries, we'll get you through this. First we're going to continue on with the church, and then I'll take you back to the cabin for those doing that version. I'm not going to go into detail on this small tree because you're basically just tracing your outline that you've put on your fabric. So this is how you would stitch it out. The nice thing about the trees and the things of nature is if you can't stay on the line on these, that's okay, because everything is different in nature. So if you can just sort of stay with the game plan on the line, you'll be fine. When you're going up these branches, when you backtrack, if you're not right on the previous line of stitching, that just gives a little bit of thickness to the branches. So that's okay also. Now watch this little fix coming up. I really missed that branch right there. So I'm going to go back and backtrack it and make it look like bark. It just made the branch a little bit thicker. And it was okay. Now don't worry about those branches behind that limb of the big tree. We'll get those later. Now I didn't make you work too awful hard on that little tree, but I'm going to make up for it on the church. I'm going to turn you into a stonemason. Now I've previously done some of this, and you can see that I'm doing this in a very contrasting thread. I tried to do it in the thread to match the fabric, but I knew you just wouldn't be able to see that. So I retraced part of the design, and I'm doing this in a dark thread so that you can see it. So before we can lay the stone, we need to get the window people in here and put the windows in. So that's what I'm doing right now. This is a good way to see how to do the windows. You're going to learn to do a lot of backtracking. I hear you all groaning right now because I know you hate doing that. But it's a process that you really need to learn in your free motion quilting. If you have to, take a piece of lined paper and an old needle and just keep stitching over those lines over and over over and over until you gain confidence tracing over a line and hitting the same place each time. This exercise will also greatly help you when you're doing stitch in the ditch with a free motion foot. Now we're going to cut this thread out of the way before we continue. And then we're going to finish this window. And this is where we're going to get into some fancy mason work. We're going to do what you see in a lot of historic buildings that are made out of stone, where they have the stone following the shape of the window. So it's really easy. All we're doing is making an out, up, and in. Out, up, and in. But we're following at this point the curve of the window, just like the masons would do back in the day. So again, we're going to go out, across, and in. Out, across, and in. I know you can do this. So I'm going to speed this up right now. And the only thing you want to be cautious of is to try to keep the distance equal when you're putting the blocks around the window. Now we're going to do the blocks under the window basically the same way. We're just doing a bunch of squares to make our windowsill. Now let's travel across that windowsill and start putting the rest of the blocks on the church. And here is just what we used to do when we were kids and we drew bricks. You would draw a square, you put a square on top of that, but you always have the next square end up in the middle of the square before that. Basically, it's just stepping stones over and over. You just don't let the same seam hit in the same place. There's no rocket science involved here. I'm sure you can handle this. But it gives a lot of texture to this church. If we didn't do this, our church would take on more of a gingerbread house look. By doing this, because we have that extra batting underneath these quasi stones, it allows those to puff up, so we're not mashing the church down, but we're giving it a really nice texture, a real realistic texture for this type of a building. When you get up to the top here, we're going to continue across. Again, we're just bringing the lines down in between the previous row. This gives you a better idea how that's done. We're not putting the seams of the bricks in the same place, or the blocks rather. And we're going to keep doing this until we get clear up to the top. And at the same time, you have to think ahead, where am I going to go next? Well, let's come down the roof. Now we hit the tree, so let's go down around that tree, and now we've got the corner of the building. Let's go across the base of the building and up so we can finish the rest of the blocks. So you're turning into quite the stonemason, aren't you? Are you having fun with this? I kind of did. I liked this. It was kind of a fun exercise. And this is your finished product when you're all done laying your blocks. Doesn't that look neat? We're moving around this scene pretty quickly here, aren't we? Now it's time for the big tree. Okay, in stitching the big tree, we're pretty much doing the same thing we did with the small tree, so we're not going to go into a lot of detail. Again, you don't have to be very super cautious about staying on the lines. Everything is different in nature. If you want to thicken up a branch, this is how you do it. Just swing out a little bit, bring it in, swing this one out a little bit, bring it away from it, and now you have a thicker branch. If you remember when we were doing the small tree, I said not to worry about those branches behind the big tree branch. So we can pick those up right here. Pretty easy, huh? Remember that little V in the tree at the top? We're just going to bypass that. Now coming down, we have to make a decision. We have that little snow nesting in the limbs of the tree. Do we go on the branch or do we go on the snow? Now I've continued up the branch here, but you could actually backtrack and pick up the stitching on the snow laying there as well. As we head down, we're running into some more branches from the small tree that we didn't do. This would be the ideal time to pick those up, so let's go ahead and do those. Now I know a lot of you are probably asking yourself, well, why is she crossing along the bottom and going back up to where she started the little tree? That's because I'm doing this separately from my main design, and that's where I happen to start it. But I think you will find it easier just to start at the base of the tree and work your way upward and back down the other side. Now let's go back and finish up that part where the snow is laying in the boughs of the tree that we didn't get before. And with that, our big tree is done, except for giving definition to the tree. Now we're ready to start texturing the tree, and we're going to go on each side of the tree trunk. And the purpose for that is as we kind of squish down, another technical term, the batting a little bit, it goes into the center of the tree. It gives a rounded effect to the tree. So this is not going to be anything real difficult to do. It's almost like the thread sketching that we did with the pine tree, only we're doing it on the very edges of the tree only. You don't want to go into the center too much. And it's just basically a back and forth. Real easy, back and forth. If you want to make a little knot, you can do that by making a circle, going up around it, coming back down, blending it in with the rest of the stitching. But it's just really up to you how you want to do these lines. You just are going to do them back and forth, just like this. Now, in an effort to keep this video at a manageable length, I'm going again to speed this up a little bit so you can see how to handle where the limbs bend. Just kind of go in that same direction. You don't need to go all the way up the branch. You might want to shade in here. And we're just going to keep going up, working our way up to the top of the side of the branch. Now I'm going to just skip right over previous stitches and come down the other side, doing the same thing. It's almost like a scrubbing back and forth type stitch that we're doing. Of course, it doesn't look all that gorgeous in the brown, but it'll blend right in when you're doing it in the same color as your background. And we'll just continue until we get down to the bottom of the tree. And that's basically how you end up shaping your tree. As Ron Popeil says in his commercials, but wait, there's more. The one thing I do want to urge you is not to do any stitching until you watch part 6 and the troubleshooting section.